The first time I walked into that new gynecologist's office, I thought my biggest problem was my nerves, not my body. The paper gowns scratched my skin, the light above my head was too bright, and I kept telling myself that this was just a routine visit, nothing more. When he finished the exam, he did not smile. He did not make small talk. He just stared for a moment, then looked me straight in the eyes and asked in a careful voice who had been treating me before now, and I answered without thinking. My husband, he has been my gynecologist for years. The room went very quiet. I could hear the clock on the wall and my own heart beating in my ears. And then he said, in that heavy, serious tone that makes your stomach drop, "We need to run some tests right away. What I am seeing should not be there." In that moment, I felt my whole past rush up at me at once. All the years I had trusted the man I married with my body and my health, and I had no idea that this was only the beginning of what I was about to find out. Thank you for staying with me and listening. It means more than you know. And if you can, please tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I truly like to know how far my voice reaches. My name is Helen, and I live in Iowa. I'm a woman who has seen many winters and many storms, but that day in the clinic, sitting there after the doctor said those words, I felt smaller than I had in a very long time, as if the floor under my feet had shifted just a little, just enough to make me reach back into my own past to remember how I got here. I met my husband when I was much younger, and still full of the kind of hope that makes you think love and intelligence will protect you from everything. He was in medical school, always with a book in his hands and a tired smile on his face. And I was the one making coffee, waiting up late, believing I was standing beside a good man who would spend his life helping others and later helping me. When he chose to become a gynecologist, I remember feeling proud. I told myself that women would be safer with a gentle man like him in the room. And I also thought, in that quiet secret place inside my heart, that I was lucky, because my own husband would understand my body, my fears, my questions better than anyone else. And I trusted that with all my heart. Over the years, it became natural that every concern, every ache, every strange cramp or worry I had went straight to him. He was not just the person sleeping beside me at night. He was the one I turned to when something did not feel right in my body, and I did not even think about going to another doctor. It never crossed my mind. Because you do not shop around for second opinions when the person you love stands there with a stethoscope and your whole history in his hands. Sitting in that room in Iowa, hearing another doctor say that what he saw should not be there, I began to feel this thin line of pain running through all those memories, through every time I had smiled and said my husband is my doctor, through every time I had brushed off a worry because he told me I was fine, and I could feel my heart starting to understand something my mind was not yet ready to say out loud. That the trust I had wrapped around him like a warm blanket might have been the very thing that left me this exposed. For a long time, I wore that trust like a badge. I would sit with neighbors over coffee here in Iowa, and when the talk turned to doctors and waiting rooms and uncomfortable exams, I would smile a little and say that I did not have to worry much about that, because my husband was my gynecologist. And women would look at me with this mix of envy and curiosity, asking what it was like. And I would answer that it felt safe, that it felt personal, that it felt like having someone who knew my body and my heart at the same time. And I believed every word I said back then. At home, it became so normal that I did not even see it happening. Each time something changed with my cycle, each time I felt a strange heaviness or a new ache, I would mention it while he was still in his shirt and tie, loosening his collar after work, and he would sigh, say he could squeeze me into his schedule. And suddenly, I would be lying on one of his exam tables while he moved between roles so easily. One moment calling me sweetheart, the next speaking like any other doctor, but without the paperwork, without the waiting, without anyone else ever looking at me. I let years go by like that. One private exam after another, always in his space, always on his terms, never once thinking to ask for records or second opinions, or even to sit across from a stranger in a different office and hear a new voice explain what was happening inside me. And I realize now that I confused intimacy with safety. I thought that, because he loved me, he would always put my health first. I thought that because he knew me so well, there was no way he could miss anything important. Somewhere along the way, I stopped listening to my own body and started listening only to him. If I felt drained, he called it stress. If I felt pain, he called it normal. If I asked whether something needed more tests, he would laugh softly and tell me not to worry, that he had seen much worse, that I should be grateful. And I took those words like medicine, swallowed them down, ignored the part of me that still felt unsettled every time I walked out of his office, and tried to convince myself that this was what love and trust were supposed to look like. It was in the years that followed that my body started trying to speak louder than his reassuring words. At first it was small things, the kind of changes you tell yourself are just part of getting older. I would wake up already tired, as if the night had not done its job. There was a dull heaviness low in my abdomen that came and went. And sometimes when I stood at the sink washing dishes, I would have to lean my weight on the counter for a moment because a strange pulling pain would move through me like a slow, unwelcome wave. I remember mentioning it to him one evening while he flipped through channels. I told him about the fatigue that did not match what I was doing and about the spotting that made no sense. And he barely looked up. He just said that women in my age range had all sorts of little troubles, that hormones were tricky, that I should not let every small sensation turn into a disaster in my head. And I sat there with my hands folded, feeling both silly and scolded, as if I had done something wrong just by paying attention to my own body. The pains did not stop though. They grew a little bolder. They showed up during walks, during quiet moments, sometimes during intimacy, and each time I brought it to him, his answer never really changed. He told me I was under stress, that I needed to rest more, that menopause could feel strange and cruel. He joked that I read too much and worried too much, and after a while I started repeating those same lines to myself, telling my own heart to hush when it tried to cry out that something was not right. Looking back now, I can see how many chances there were to ask for tests, to ask for another pair of eyes. But at the time I was standing inside a life built on the belief that my husband knew best, that his degree and his experience meant the story he told about my body had to be the true one, and I pushed my unease down so deep that even I began to mistake it for silence. As time went on, the aches that used to visit once in a while began to feel like permanent guests. The spotting became more regular, and there were days when a sharp, pinching pain would make me stop halfway up the stairs with my hand pressed against the wall. And I remember telling him that it scared me, that it felt wrong in a way I could not quite explain. But instead of leaning in and listening, he sighed and rubbed his forehead like I was bringing him another problem after a long day. He told me again that it was my age, that I was under too much pressure, that I needed to calm down and stop imagining worst-case scenes from every little twinge, and there was something in his tone that made me feel childish, though I was far from being a girl. So I swallowed my fear and nodded. There were nights when I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, counting the times he had given me the same answer with different words, and I thought about calling another clinic, about just making one quiet appointment somewhere across town. But every time I reached for the phone, I heard his voice in my head asking why I did not trust him, reminding me of all the years he had studied and all the women he had helped, and the guilt would wrap itself around my hand until I set the phone back down. The more my body tried to get my attention, the more I turned my attention toward keeping the peace. I told myself that marriage meant loyalty, that questioning his judgment as a doctor might sound like questioning him as a man. And in trying not to hurt his pride, I kept ignoring my own pain. I cooked his meals, washed his white coats, listened to him talk about patients he had seen that day, all while hiding the truth that I was growing afraid of what he was not seeing in me, and even more afraid that deep down he simply did not want to look. The day everything finally cracked did not start with sirens or drama. It began like any other ordinary evening. I was in the kitchen in Iowa, stirring a pot of soup, moving slowly because that familiar low pain was pulsing in my abdomen again. And he walked in with his tie loosened, and his phone in his hand. But instead of dropping a kiss on my cheek or telling me about his day, he cleared his throat and said my name in that careful way people use when they are about to break something fragile. He told me he was leaving, just like that. He said he had fallen in love with someone else. A younger nurse from his clinic, someone who understood him, someone who made him feel alive again. And as he stood there explaining his new bright future, all I could feel was that same tired ache in my body and a deeper ache opening up in my chest, as if both my heart and my health had been pushed aside for something shinier. I remember looking at him and thinking how strange it was that the man who had spent years telling me not to worry about my own pain, calling it stress and age, had somehow found the energy and clarity to start an entirely new life with someone new. He talked about how we had grown apart, about how he hoped we could be civil, about how he would still be there for practical things if I needed anything. And all I heard was the echo of the word leaving ringing in my ears. Leaving this house, leaving this marriage, leaving the body he had promised to care for as both husband and doctor. When he carried his suitcase to the door, his white coat slung over his arm, the house felt so quiet that even my breathing sounded loud. I watched him walk down the steps, and I felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity wash over me. Grief because the man I had built a life with was choosing someone else, and clarity because for the first time in decades, his opinion did not have to be the final word on what I did with my own body. That night I lay in bed alone, the spot beside me already cold, and I placed my hand on my lower belly, where the pain had lived for so long, and I whispered to myself that whatever was happening inside me, I could not keep pretending it was nothing. Not anymore. Not after he had shown me so clearly that his loyalty had limits, while my body and my life were the only things I truly had left to fight for. After he left, the house felt like it was holding its breath with me. For a few weeks I moved through the rooms like a ghost, cooking smaller meals, washing fewer clothes, lying down when the pain grew sharp, and telling myself that once the dust settled I would feel better. But instead the fatigue deepened, and the pull low in my abdomen became heavier, like a stone I could not set down. And one morning, I woke up and realized that if I kept waiting for a man who was already building a life somewhere else to care about what was happening inside my body, I might be waiting until it was too late. That thought scared me enough that I reached for the phone, my hand shaking as I looked up a clinic across town, a place where no one knew my husband, where no one would see me as his wife first and a patient second. And when the receptionist asked what brought me in, I felt my voice tremble as I said I had been having ongoing pain and bleeding, and that I had not seen anyone but my husband for many years. She was kind. She gave me an appointment. And when I hung up, I sat there at the kitchen table in Iowa with the morning light on my hands, and felt both guilty and strangely relieved, as if I had just broken a silent rule that had never been good for me in the first place. On the day of the appointment, I almost talked myself out of going. I stood in front of the mirror and told myself it was probably nothing, that he had always said I was fine, that I did not want to make a fool of myself in front of a new doctor. But underneath all those excuses was a deeper fear. The fear of hearing bad news, the fear of finding out that all those years of being told not to worry had cost me something I could not get back. And yet there was another fear beside it, the fear of doing nothing, of waking up one day in a hospital bed, wishing I had listened to my own body sooner. I took my purse, my insurance card, and that mix of dread and determination, and I drove across town, parked in front of a building I had never entered before, and sat in the car for a full minute just watching people go in and out, wondering how many of them had ignored their own pain the way I had. And finally I whispered to myself that, whatever happened, I owed myself at least the truth. When I walked through those doors, the smell of antiseptic and paper and quiet voices wrapped around me. The receptionist took my name and handed me forms. I wrote down my history, my surgeries, my symptoms, and when I reached the line asking for my previous physician, I hesitated for just a second before writing my husband's name, feeling a twist in my chest as I saw the letters on the page, as if I was finally admitting to a stranger how much I had placed in his hands. Sitting in that waiting room in Iowa, listening to my own heartbeat and the distant sound of footsteps in the hall, I felt like I was standing on a bridge between two lives. The one where I kept pretending everything was normal because he said so, and the one where I finally let someone else look at the damage I could no longer ignore. And when the nurse called my name and led me back to that exam room, I took a deep breath and told myself that whatever the new doctor found, at least this time, I would hear it from someone whose first duty was to my health and not to his own pride. The nurse led me into a small exam room with pale walls and a rustling paper sheet on the table. And as she closed the door behind her, I sat there for a moment on the edge of that table in my gown, my feet not quite touching the floor, feeling like a schoolgirl called into the office and an old woman facing judgment all at once. Then the doctor came in, a calm man with tired but kind eyes. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and instead of rushing straight into an exam, he sat down and asked me to tell him my story in my own words. I told him about the years of pain, the strange bleeding, the fatigue that clung to me even after quiet days, and I told him, with a kind of shame that surprised me, that the only gynecologist I had seen for 3 decades was my husband. I watched his eyebrows lift just slightly, not in gossip or drama, but in the way a person does when a puzzle piece falls into their hands. He wrote a few notes, asked careful questions that no one had ever asked me before, like when exactly the symptoms started, how often they happened, what my previous exams had looked like, what tests had been run, and I realized how many times I had simply taken my husband's words without ever seeing a single report for myself. When it came time for the physical exam, he spoke gently, telling me what he would do before he did it, making sure I was comfortable. And even though the position was familiar, the feeling was different. There was a distance, a professionalism, a sense that this man was looking at me as a patient first, not as someone whose reactions might bruise his ego at home later. And for the first time in a long time, I felt both exposed and strangely seen. As he examined me, the room grew very quiet. I watched his face from where I lay, and I saw it change, not in a dramatic way, but in a tightening around the eyes, a small deepening of the line between his brows, the sort of expression that tells you something does not sit right. And even before he spoke, my heart began to thud harder in my chest, because I knew what it meant when a doctor stopped filling silence with small talk and instead just stared at a point only he could see. When he finished, he helped me sit up, pulled his stool closer, and looked straight at me, his voice steady as he asked again who had been managing my care. And when I repeated that it had always been my husband, that I had never had another gynecologist, he nodded slowly and told me that, based on what he had felt and seen, there were things going on inside me that needed a much closer look, that some changes did not match the story in my chart, and that we could not afford to wait. He said we needed several tests as soon as possible, imaging and blood work, that there were signs of irritation and scarring that should not have been left alone this long. Sitting there in that small room in Iowa with the paper gown scratching at my skin, I felt fear rise in my throat like a wave. But alongside it came something else, a bitter realization that whatever was wrong in my body had not appeared overnight. It had been building quietly over the same years when I had been told, over and over, that everything was fine. And as he handed me the orders for those tests, my hands trembled, not just from what he might find, but from the dawning understanding that the person I had trusted most to protect me had either looked away or chosen not to see. The days that followed felt longer than any I had lived through in Iowa. I went from one room to another, from the lab where they drew my blood to the dim ultrasound room where cold gel spread over my skin, and the technician moved the wand in slow circles, her eyes fixed on the screen, while I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying not to read too much in the silence. And when all the tests were finally done, I went home, carrying a heaviness that was more than just fear. It was the weight of every year I had spent believing that questions made me ungrateful. When the new doctor called me back in to discuss the results, I sat in that same small office with my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. He did not waste time with empty comfort. He spoke gently but clearly. He showed me the images, pointed out the small scars, the old lesions, the places where tissue did not look the way it should have if someone had been watching closely. And then he took a breath and told me that the tests showed early-stage cancer, something that did not appear in a month or even a year, something that had been growing quietly inside me while I was being told that I was simply getting older. He said that the device inside me had been left far longer than any responsible doctor would recommend, that it had caused chronic irritation and damage, and when he added that some of what he saw suggested procedures done without proper follow-up or documented consent, I felt as if the room tilted. Because in that moment, it was not just my body that felt violated, it was my trust, my memory, my whole marriage. All the times I had walked out of my husband's office believing I was safe, while something inside me was being slowly ignored. When he finished explaining the results, he grew very quiet. Then he looked at me with a kind of anger that was not directed at me, but at what had been done. He said my name softly, and told me that this did not look like simple oversight, that from a medical point of view, there had been more than enough warning signs over the years to justify further tests, and that leaving that device inside me for so long without regular checks went against everything he'd been trained to do. He chose his words carefully. He did not accuse anyone outright. But when he said that it almost looked controlled, as if someone wanted to keep my questions contained, rather than truly answered, I felt something inside me crack in a way that hurt more than the news about the cancer. Because it meant this was not just about sickness. It was about betrayal. I walked out of that office into the bright Iowa daylight with a folder of papers in my hand and a storm inside my chest. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel, remembering every moment my husband had laughed at my worries, every time he had told me to stop imagining things, and now another doctor was telling me that what he had ignored could have cost me my life. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them against my knees. And in that parking lot I whispered to myself that I could not carry this alone, that I needed someone who would believe me and help me make sense of the records and the gaps and the years I had spent trusting a man who had treated my body like it was his territory, not my own. The first person I turned to was not a doctor and not a lawyer. It was a quiet woman from our church here in Iowa who worked as a patient advocate at the local hospital. She had sat beside many people who felt lost in medical words. And when I told her what the new gynecologist had found, she did not tell me to calm down or to be grateful it was early. She looked me straight in the eye and said that I had a right to every piece of my own history. She helped me file the request for my records from my husband's clinic, every visit, every note, every supposed test. And when the envelope finally arrived, we sat together at my kitchen table and began to read, page after page filled with his handwriting and check marks and phrases like symptoms resolved and patient reassured. And I felt my stomach twist, because I remembered those visits. I remembered walking out still in pain, yet, here on the paper, it said I was doing well. My advocate pointed out missing dates, vague descriptions, references to scans and follow-up that I knew had never happened, and the more we matched my memories to his records, the clearer it became that this was not just about a disease sneaking past the best intentions. This was about a pattern of someone deciding what story would be written about my body, even when that story did not match the truth. And as we turned those pages, my anger slowly steadied into something else. A cold, clear resolve that I would no longer let anyone, not even a man I once loved, narrate my pain for me. The next step was the hardest, because it meant fighting on two fronts at the same time. I started treatment with the new doctor, sitting through long hours in that chair while the medicine dripped into my veins, and the nurse in Iowa tucked a warm blanket around my legs. And on those same days, my advocate helped me take the folder of records and the notes from the new tests to an attorney who specialized in medical cases. He listened quietly as I told him about the years of pain, about the marriage, about the way my husband's handwriting on those charts did not match the reality of what I had lived. And instead of brushing it aside, he nodded and said there were serious questions that needed answers. He talked about the medical board, about complaints and investigations, words that made my head swim. But beneath the fear there was also a small, steady flame of relief. Because for the first time, people with knowledge and authority were standing beside me, looking at what had been done and saying out loud that it was not right. Walking out of that office, into the cool Iowa air, weak from treatment but stronger in a different way, I understood that even if I could not change the years I had lost, I could choose what happened next. I could choose to tell the truth, to put his choices under a light he could not control, and to make sure that my story was no longer just something hidden in his private files, but a testimony of what can happen when trust is used as a shield to cover neglect and control. In the months that followed, while the investigation slowly moved forward and my treatments continued, my life in Iowa became quieter on the outside, but clearer on the inside. I heard that the younger nurse he had left me for quietly packed her things and walked away from him once she learned what was being uncovered. And a part of me felt sad for her, because she had believed in his image the way I once did. But most of my energy went into healing, into letting my new doctor guide me, into honoring every small sign of strength my body showed. Even on the days when I felt so tired I could barely lift my head from the pillow, I would remind myself that this time I was choosing my own care. I do not know yet how every piece of the legal part will end. Boards and committees move slowly, but I do know this. The man who once stood between me and every second opinion can no longer hide what he did behind closed doors and a white coat. And for me, that already feels like a kind of justice, because the silence he counted on has been broken. When I sit by the window now and watch the light move across the fields, I think about all the years I spent believing that love meant never questioning, never doubting, and I wish I could reach back through time and hold that younger version of myself, who thought that loyalty required her to ignore her own pain. I would tell her that trust should never demand that you stay blind. That if something feels wrong in your body, you have every right to ask again. To ask someone new. To keep asking until you are heard. If you are listening to me now, and any part of my story sounds even a little bit like your own, please know this. You are not difficult for wanting answers. You are not ungrateful for needing proof. Your body and your life belong to you, no matter who stands beside you or what title they carry, and you deserve care that respects that. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of my story. It means more than I can say. And if this touched your heart in any way, I would be grateful if you subscribe so you can be here with me for the next story I share.